The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as guard James Mitchell took his position at the ceremonial post. At 23 years old, James had served in the Queen's Guard for 2 years, earning respect for his unwavering dedication and impeccable discipline. His red tunic was pressed to perfection, his bearskin hat positioned with military precision, and his rifle held at the exact angle required by centuries of tradition. James came from a humble background in Yorkshire. His father worked in a coal mine and his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. When James announced his intention to join the military and eventually serve in the prestigious Queen's Guard, his family was filled with pride. The position represented honor, tradition, and service to the crown, values deeply ingrained in James from childhood. The Queen's Guard had always been more than just a ceremonial role. These soldiers were active military personnel, rigorously trained and selected for their exceptional standards. James had undergone months of intensive training, learning not only the precise movements and protocols required for ceremonial duties, but also maintaining his skills as a combat-ready soldier. Every morning he woke before dawn to prepare his uniform, polish his boots until they gleamed like mirrors, and review the day's procedures. On this particular Wednesday morning, the palace was buzzing with more activity than usual. A group of high-ranking military officers from various Commonwealth countries was visiting for a special ceremony honoring international military cooperation. Among them was Colonel Richardson, a career officer known throughout military circles for his strict adherence to protocol and his sometimes abrasive personality. Colonel Richardson had served for over 30 years, rising through the ranks with a reputation for demanding absolute respect and obedience from those beneath him. He had commanded troops in several international missions and prided himself on maintaining military discipline wherever he went. His chest was adorned with numerous medals and ribbons, each telling a story of his long and distinguished career. As the morning progressed, tourists began gathering outside the palace gates, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. James remained motionless at his post, a living statue embodying the strength and dignity of the British military. His training had taught him to ignore distractions, weather conditions, and even minor provocations while on duty. The palace protocol was clear and had been refined over generations. Guards were instructed to remain at attention, eyes forward, and to respond only to specific commands from authorized personnel within the established chain of command. They were taught to treat their duty with the utmost seriousness, understanding that they represented not just the military, but the entire nation in the eyes of visitors from around the world. Colonel Richardson emerged from the palace with his delegation, pointing out various architectural features and explaining the significance of different ceremonial elements to his international colleagues. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. As they approached James's position, the colonel began explaining the role and training of the Queen's Guard to the visiting officers. These guards undergo extensive training, Colonel Richardson explained to his companions. They represent the pinnacle of military discipline and protocol. His tone suggested both respect for the institution and a personal sense of superiority that came from his rank and experience. The group paused near James's post, and Colonel Richardson continued his impromptu lecture. The Queen's Guard maintains the highest standards of military bearing, he said, his voice growing louder as if to demonstrate his knowledge and authority to both his colleagues and any nearby tourists who might be listening. James remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead as his training demanded. He could hear every word but showed no sign of acknowledgement. This was exactly as it should be according to protocol. Guards were not supposed to interact with visitors or respond to commentary about their duties. However, Colonel Richardson seemed to interpret James's proper adherence to protocol as a slight to his authority. Perhaps influenced by the presence of his international colleagues or simply accustomed to immediate recognition of his rank, The colonel stepped closer to James's position. "You there, guard," Colonel Richardson called out sharply, his voice taking on the commanding tone he had used for decades when addressing subordinates. "I am Colonel Richardson. Acknowledge my presence with the proper military courtesy." James did not move. His training was crystal clear on this matter. While on ceremonial duty, guards were to maintain their position and bearing unless receiving orders from their direct chain of command or in response to specific security threats. A visiting officer, regardless of rank, did not have the authority to command ceremonial guards to break protocol. The colonel's face began to redden slightly. He was unaccustomed to what he perceived as insubordination, though James was actually following proper procedure. The visiting international officers watched with growing interest, sensing that something unusual was developing. "I said acknowledge my presence, soldier," Colonel Richardson repeated, his voice rising with irritation. "I am a full colonel in Her Majesty's service, and I expect the proper respect due to my rank." The tourists nearby had begun to notice the interaction, some quietly filming with their phones, while others whispered among themselves. The situation was attracting exactly the kind of attention that palace security preferred to avoid. But James continued to follow his training, remaining motionless and silent. Colonel Richardson took another step closer, now standing directly in front of James. "When a superior officer addresses you, the correct response is to acknowledge with appropriate military courtesy," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I am ordering you to salute." The word ordering hung in the air like a challenge. James felt the weight of the moment, but also the clarity of his training. He knew the protocols, understood the chain of command, and recognized that this situation was testing not just his discipline, but also his understanding of duty and proper military procedure. The visiting officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. Some tourists had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing drama unfolding before their eyes. Palace security personnel in the distance had noticed the commotion and were quietly moving closer while trying to remain inconspicuous. Colonel Richardson's military decorations caught the morning sunlight as he stood rigidly before James. His expectation of immediate compliance written clearly across his face. Years of commanding troops had conditioned him to expect instant obedience, and this apparent defiance was both puzzling and infuriating. James's mind raced through his training. He thought of his instructors who had drilled into him the importance of following protocol exactly, without exception. He remembered the pride in his parents' eyes when he first donned the uniform of the Queen's Guard. Most importantly, he understood that his duty was not just to look impressive for tourists, but to uphold centuries of military tradition and proper procedure. The moment stretched on, with neither man willing to back down. Colonel Richardson represented the authority of rank and experience, while James embodied the discipline and protocol that formed the backbone of military tradition. The confrontation had moved beyond a simple misunderstanding to become a test of principles that would have consequences far beyond this single morning. As the tension built, other guards at nearby positions remained perfectly still, following their own training while undoubtedly aware of the drama unfolding near their colleague. The palace courtyard, usually filled with the peaceful murmur of tourist conversations and the occasional bark of commands during routine procedures, had taken on an electric quality as everyone present sensed they were witnessing something significant. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge assumptions about authority, protocol, and the true meaning of military discipline. The standoff continued as more tourists gathered, sensing something extraordinary happening. Colonel Richardson's face was now visibly flushed with anger and embarrassment. In his 3 decades of military service, he had never encountered what he perceived as such blatant disrespect from a lower-ranking soldier. "This is your final warning." "Guard!" Colonel Richardson said through gritted teeth, his voice low but carrying enough authority to make even the visiting officers step back slightly. "I am giving you a direct order to salute. Your continued insubordination will be reported to your commanding officer." James remained statue-like, his breathing steady and controlled. Inside, he felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. He understood the gravity of the situation, but also knew with absolute certainty that his response was correct according to military protocol. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario, though he had never imagined it would involve such a high-ranking officer in front of international visitors. Captain Williams, James's direct commanding officer, had been observing from a distance and now approached the scene. At 35, Captain Williams was respected for his fair leadership and deep understanding of both military protocol and the unique requirements of ceremonial duties. He had served with distinction in Afghanistan before being assigned to oversee the Queen's Guard, and his soldiers trusted his judgment implicitly. As Captain Williams drew closer, he could see the tension radiating from Colonel Richardson and the perfect discipline being maintained by James. The captain immediately understood the situation and felt a surge of pride in his guard's adherence to proper protocol, even under pressure from a superior officer. "Good morning, Colonel Richardson," Captain Williams said with professional courtesy as he approached. "I see you're observing our ceremonial procedures. Is there something I can assist you with?" Colonel Richardson turned toward Captain Williams with obvious relief at having someone of appropriate rank to address his grievance. "Captain, I have just given this guard a direct order to acknowledge my presence with proper military courtesy, and he has completely ignored me. This level of insubordination is unacceptable and reflects poorly on your unit's discipline." Captain Williams nodded thoughtfully, maintaining a respectful tone while internally preparing to defend his soldier. "Colonel, I appreciate your concern for military courtesy. However, our ceremonial guards operate under specific protocols that have been refined over many years. Perhaps I could explain our procedures?" The visiting international officers moved closer, clearly interested in understanding the situation. Among them was General Martinez from Canada, Colonel Thompson from Australia, and Major Singh from New Zealand. All were experienced military leaders who understood the complexity of balancing rank, protocol, and ceremonial duties. "These guards are under strict orders to maintain their ceremonial bearing while on post," Captain Williams explained calmly. "They are authorized to respond only to their direct chain of command or in cases of immediate security concerns. This protocol ensures the integrity and consistency of the ceremonial program." Colonel Richardson's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting, Captain, that a guard is justified in ignoring a direct order from a colonel?" "With respect, sir," Captain Williams replied, "the guard is not ignoring orders, but rather following them precisely. His orders are to maintain ceremonial bearing while on post. He has no authority to deviate from those orders, regardless of who might request otherwise." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, and many were now openly recording the interaction with their phones. Palace security had positioned themselves strategically around the area, ready to intervene if necessary, while hoping the situation could be resolved through proper channels. General Martinez, the senior officer among the visiting delegation, stepped forward. His experience in international military cooperation had taught him to recognize when protocol differences could escalate unnecessarily. "Gentlemen," he said diplomatically, "perhaps we could step away from the ceremonial area to discuss this matter further." Colonel Richardson turned to face the general, his frustration evident. "General Martinez, I believe you would agree that military hierarchy and respect for rank are fundamental principles that cannot be compromised for the sake of ceremonial procedures." General Martinez nodded slowly. "Absolutely, Colonel. However, I've found that different military units often have specialized protocols that serve specific purposes. In Canada, our ceremonial guards operate under similar constraints to ensure consistency and respect for tradition." Major Singh from New Zealand added his perspective. In my experience, ceremonial duties often require protocols that might seem unusual to those of us in regular command positions. The guards' inability to respond to individual requests actually demonstrates their discipline rather than lack of respect. James continued to stand perfectly still throughout this discussion, though he was acutely aware of every word being spoken. His training had taught him to remain focused on his duty regardless of distractions, but he couldn't help feeling grateful for his captain's support and the understanding being shown by the visiting officers. Colonel Richardson looked around at the group, realizing that his position was not receiving the support he had expected. His military mind began to process the implications of the situation. He was a seasoned officer who had earned respect through years of service, but he was also intelligent enough to recognize when he might need to reassess his approach. Captain Williams seized the moment to provide additional context. "Colonel, if I may, our guards undergo extensive training in these protocols precisely because they interact with thousands of visitors each year, including many military personnel from around the world. If they responded to every request from visiting officers, the ceremonial program would become chaotic and lose its dignity." Colonel Thompson from Australia nodded in agreement. "That makes perfect sense, Captain. We face similar challenges with our ceremonial units at Parliament House. Clear, consistent protocols are essential for maintaining both security and ceremonial integrity." The wisdom of the established protocols was becoming clear to everyone present. James's steadfast adherence to his orders was not an act of defiance, but rather a demonstration of exactly the kind of discipline and reliability that made the Queen's Guard such a respected institution. Colonel Richardson found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His initial anger was giving way to a growing realization that he might have misunderstood the situation. The support from his international colleagues for the Guard's behavior was forcing him to reconsider his interpretation of events. "I suppose," Colonel Richardson said slowly, "that in my eagerness to ensure proper military courtesy, I may have overlooked the specific requirements of ceremonial duty." His admission was difficult, but showed the character that had carried him through decades of military service. Captain Williams recognized the colonel's attempt to find a graceful resolution. "Sir, your concern for military discipline is exactly what we would expect from an officer of your experience and standing. The protocols we follow are designed to uphold those same principles in a ceremonial context." The tension in the air began to dissipate as understanding replaced confrontation. James remained at attention, but those observing could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The crowd of tourists, many of whom had been holding their breath without realizing it, began to relax as they sensed the crisis was passing. General Martinez suggested that the group move to a nearby area where Captain Williams could provide a more detailed explanation of the Queen's Guard protocols without disrupting the ceremonial duties. Colonel Richardson agreed, though his pride was still somewhat bruised by the public nature of the misunderstanding. As they prepared to move away from James's post, Colonel Richardson paused and looked back at the young guard who had remained perfectly disciplined throughout the entire confrontation. For the first time since the incident began, the colonel saw James not as an insubordinate soldier but as a dedicated professional carrying out his duties with remarkable composure under pressure. The group moved toward a quieter area of the palace grounds, leaving James to continue his ceremonial duty. The young guard maintained his perfect bearing, but inside he felt a profound sense of relief and validation. His training, his understanding of protocol, and his commitment to duty had been tested in the most challenging circumstances imaginable, and he had proven equal to the task. The incident was far from over, however. Word of the confrontation was already beginning to spread through both military channels and social media as tourists shared their videos and photos of the dramatic standoff between the high-ranking officer and the immovable guard. The resolution of the immediate crisis would prove to be only the beginning of a much larger conversation about military tradition, protocol, and respect. Within hours of the confrontation, videos of the incident had gone viral across social media platforms. The footage showed Colonel Richardson's increasingly frustrated attempts to get James to salute, followed by the arrival of Captain Williams and the diplomatic resolution involving the international officers. Comments poured in from military veterans, tourists who had been present, and civilians debating the nature of military protocol and respect. The reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of James's actions. Military veterans from around the world shared their own experiences with ceremonial duties, explaining how the protocols exist to maintain order and dignity in formal situations. Many praised the young guard's composure under pressure and his unwavering commitment to following proper procedures. Colonel Richardson watched the coverage from his hotel room with growing discomfort. The comment sections were filled with criticism of his behavior, with many suggesting he had abused his authority and embarrassed himself in front of international colleagues. Some comments were harsh, questioning whether an officer of his experience should have understood military protocol better. That evening, Colonel Richardson sat alone in his quarters, reflecting on the day's events. His military career had been built on principles of honor, duty, and respect for proper procedure. The realization that he had violated these very principles in his confrontation with James weighed heavily on his mind. Meanwhile, James completed his shift with his usual professionalism, though he was aware of the attention the incident had generated. His fellow guards offered quiet words of support and respect for how he had handled the situation. Captain Williams pulled him aside after his duty ended to commend his adherence to protocol and his remarkable composure. "You represented everything we stand for today," Captain Williams told James privately. "Your commitment to duty under pressure was exactly what we trained for, and you should be proud of how you conducted yourself." James felt a mixture of relief and lingering nervousness about the wider implications of the incident. He had simply done his job according to his training, but the viral nature of the videos meant his actions were now being scrutinized by millions of people worldwide. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Colonel Richardson requested a private meeting with Captain Williams and James. His tone was formal but respectful, lacking the anger and frustration that had characterized his demeanor during the confrontation. In the meeting room at the palace, Colonel Richardson stood as James entered with Captain Williams. The colonel's bearing was still military perfect, but his expression showed a humility that had been absent the day before. "Guard Mitchell," Colonel Richardson began, his voice steady but carrying a note of genuine respect. "I owe you an apology. My behavior yesterday was inappropriate and reflected a misunderstanding of your duties and protocols on my part." James maintained his respectful military bearing, but was clearly surprised by the colonel's words. Captain Williams nodded encouragingly, indicating that James should respond appropriately. "Sir, I was simply following my training and orders," James replied professionally. "I meant no disrespect to your rank or service." Colonel Richardson nodded appreciatively. "That's exactly the point, Guard Mitchell. You were doing precisely what a disciplined soldier should do, following orders and maintaining protocol despite pressure to do otherwise. I allowed my ego and unfamiliarity with your specific duties to cloud my judgment." The colonel paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "In my 30 years of service, I've always prided myself on understanding military discipline and protocol. Yesterday, I learned that there's always more to learn, and that true discipline sometimes means having the courage to maintain your position even when challenged by someone of higher rank." Captain Williams observed the exchange with satisfaction. This was the kind of resolution that strengthened rather than damaged military relationships and mutual respect between officers and enlisted personnel. Colonel Richardson continued, I've spoken with the international delegation, and we've all gained a greater appreciation for the complexity and importance of ceremonial duties. Your adherence to protocol yesterday was a credit to your unit and to the entire military. James felt a profound sense of vindication and relief. The support from his superiors, and now the acknowledgement from Colonel Richardson, confirmed that his actions had been correct and professional. Furthermore, Colonel Richardson added, I will be writing a formal commendation for your service record, highlighting your exemplary discipline and protocol adherence under challenging circumstances. Your actions yesterday demonstrated the highest standards of military bearing. The meeting concluded with mutual salutes and handshakes. Colonel Richardson had transformed what could have been a permanently damaging incident into a learning experience that ultimately strengthened respect for military tradition and proper procedure. News of Colonel Richardson's apology and commendation spread as quickly as the original confrontation videos had gone viral. Military communities worldwide praised both men, James for his unwavering discipline, and Colonel Richardson for his character in acknowledging his mistake and making appropriate amends. The incident became a teaching moment used in military academies and training programs around the world. It illustrated the importance of understanding specific protocols, the value of maintaining discipline under pressure, and the character required to admit mistakes and make them right. James returned to his duties with renewed confidence and pride in his role. The viral attention gradually faded, but the respect he had earned from his peers and superiors remained. His parents in Yorkshire watched the news coverage with immense pride, seeing their son honored for upholding the values they had taught him. Colonel Richardson completed his visit to London with enhanced respect from his international colleagues. His handling of the aftermath demonstrated the kind of leadership and character that had earned him his rank and decorations. The incident became a reminder that even experienced officers could learn from junior personnel who maintained their principles under pressure. Months later, the story was still referenced in military circles as an example of how proper protocol serves important purposes and how true military discipline requires both following orders and having the courage to maintain correct procedures even under pressure from higher authority. The Queen's Guard continued their ceremonial duties with the same precision and dedication they had always shown, but with additional recognition for the complexity and importance of their role. Tourists visiting Buckingham Palace often asked their guides about the guard who wouldn't salute, learning about military protocol and the principles that guide ceremonial duties. James was eventually promoted and later selected for advanced training, with the incident serving as evidence of his reliability and commitment to duty. He never forgot the lesson that doing the right thing, even when difficult, ultimately earned more respect than taking the easy path of compliance with improper requests. The story became legendary within the Queen's Guard, told to new recruits as an example of how their training and protocols exist for important reasons and must be maintained regardless of external pressure. It reinforced the understanding that ceremonial duty is not merely pageantry, but a serious military responsibility requiring the highest standards of discipline and professionalism. Colonel Richardson's career continued successfully, enhanced by the respect he earned for his mature handling of his mistake. He often spoke to junior officers about the importance of understanding different military roles and protocols, using his experience as an example of how continuous learning and humility are essential qualities for effective leadership. The viral videos eventually faded from social media trends, but the principles they illustrated, duty, discipline, respect for protocol, and the character to acknowledge mistakes, remained timeless lessons that continued to inspire military personnel and civilians alike. The confrontation that had begun with misunderstanding and frustration had transformed into a powerful demonstration of the values that make military service meaningful and respected.